Kia ora. Good morning, everyone from New Zealand. And I'd like to introduce panel 19, Returning to the Sources, Manuscript and Material. And each of us will introduce ourselves briefly, and then we'll start with a discussion that I will be facilitating. My name is Joseph Zizek, and I teach early modern French history at the University of Auckland. And my specialty is the French Revolution and historical consciousness and collective practices around voluntarism. And this is a fascinating panel because of the way in which many of the issues raised by today's panelists echo through not just the medieval period, but also the early modern period. And my role will be to help facilitate discussion between our three experts and to ask some questions that are perspectival for each of them. So I would like to turn it over to the experts so that they can introduce one another individually.
Hi, I'm Neel. I teach at Colorado College in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where it is now late afternoon. I am a specialist in the Order of Prémontré, a religious order founded in the 12th century. More broadly, my work is about medieval spirituality. Yeah.
Thank you, Carol.
Hi, I'm Andrew Brown. I've been at Massey University for the last 10 years. Before that, I was in the UK. I originally worked on popular religion in late medieval England before crossing the Channel to Flanders, where I've been for many years, writing about Bruges, and recently did a collaborative work with lots of Flemish scholars on medieval Bruges. Although I worked on religion and ritual, I've kind of shifted a little bit towards working on late medieval recreation and late medieval games, and this is where I've got to with the pardon letters.
Hi, I'm Amanda McVitty, and I'm a lecturer in history, also at Massey University in New Zealand. I work broadly on sort of gender, law, and political culture in the late medieval period, moving into the 16th century. So crossing that medieval, early modern sort of boundary. And at the moment, I'm actually partway through a 3-year Royal Society of New Zealand funded project looking specifically at masculinity and authority in the formation of English common law culture, so over the period of around 1300 through to roughly 1600. And that's where the research I'm talking about today is coming out of that project.
Okay. Thank you, Carol, Andrew, and Amanda. Now, the way this will work, we'll talk for about 30 to 40 minutes between us, and I'll give us a warning when we're short on time. And I expect that most of the conversation will be between and among you, but I want to offer some perspectival questions that will bring all three of your papers together. And if I could start with the big picture question, that what struck me listening to your talks was the way that all three of you are engaged in a work of recovery or reconstruction or revision about something really significant. Andrew, finding recreation both as a social practice and a rhetorical practice in these letters of pardon. Or Amanda, looking at the legal documents, legal manuscripts that circulate in the Inns of Court and Chancery, and seeing in them not the legal content, but the material and life world of the owners and lawyers and students that they create. And Carol, looking at an important document that comes to us through cycles of reprinting and appropriation, and going back to the original manuscript from the 19th century version and showing that, you know, to paraphrase Gertrude Stein, there's no there. In other words, that the thing we take as an artifact is in fact a creation of this long process of what would you say are the key obstacles or challenges that you face in this process of revision or reconstruction? And what would you say the next steps would be for each of your projects? So I'll turn that over to all of you.
Yeah, maybe I should begin since I am earliest in that sense here. Actually, in my case, there's a very specific outcome here. That's, for a long time, I've been involved with a project called Premonstratensian Texts and Studies, which is a series of publications of texts and studies having to do with the 12th century Order of Prémontré and its successors are the members of the order across time. We have focused so far on the 12th century, and this is a fun thing to think about because it's sort of a monastic joke. That is, Premonstratensian Texts and Studies is part of a distinguished series called the Cistercian Fathers series, itself published by the Benedictines. Now, all of these orders have had, some controversy across time, but in the end, today, when they are much reduced, they do all they can to help each other. So we're very proud to have initiated that project. One of the upcoming volumes will be a translation and commentary on Philip of Harvangt, and I am sort of the midwife of this volume. I will actually have not done that translation, but I did the manuscript legwork toward that improved representation of what Philip's work is really about. So I enjoy very much collaborative enterprises, and this one is supremely so. So.
Yes, so on these pardon letters, which I kind of started on a couple of years ago, and I've been busy trying to transcribe all the material. And the difficulty I've got with them principally is trying to understand exactly what narratives work, how they work, and how they're put together in these texts, because you read quite a number of them, and the stories all seem different. But of course, they're very much within this legal context, which you've got to understand as well, and therefore they've got to kind of fit what is going to get them basically a pardon, and therefore you've got to kind of understand what the limits and the thresholds of good behaviour or bad behaviour might be, and how it is they can present themselves. And therefore it becomes very, very difficult for me to kind of see them as social texts telling us about the social world, when in fact they're a performance from start to finish, and that they have certain patterns, and you've got to kind of decipher what these are. So I find this quite difficult, and then at the same time trying to pick out, well, what is it they're referring to when they refer to themselves as playing in a certain manner, a certain game, or in a certain way. Well, what are the texts that they're referring to in order to create the right impression, in order to get them a pardon? Mm-hmm. And this kind of leads me outside to other texts into all sorts of different directions, and many more than I had expected. I've got to clearly understand the kind of medical treatises about how emotions operated, mm-hmm. When you could lose your temper, and when you were not supposed to, what counted it as a deadly sin, and what didn't. When you lost your temper, say, as well as the kind of theological questions about recreation, and why it is that a humble supplicant, a labourer in the field, should know anything about Aquinas. But clearly this is referenced, so how does this come about? And therefore, do labourers actually understand anything about the schoolmen, or all these pardon letters written by their notaries and lawyers? So how to use these pardon letters to get at a wider social world, which I'm interested in as a historian, I'm finding quite a challenge. But the ultimate aim is to perhaps to try and understand better what ordinary people, how they interpreted their own recreation and leisure and games, and whether there was a kind of distinct activity that they recognised as recreation. So that's the kind of some of the problems I'm finding.
Amanda?
So for me, I think this is I'm at the earlier stages of this project I'm working now, and I've only really been able to do one kind of big trip to the archive. So of course, one of our challenges as medievalists and early modernists working in New Zealand is always just getting access to our archives, and we have to be very, use our month or so a year in the archives very well. But apart from that, I was actually, when I first started working with these manuscripts, I initially thought I wouldn't find that much, and I found them much, much richer than I ever expected. And I think that partly certainly had some things I related to in your presentation, Carol, where you were talking about going back from those printed volumes to the original manuscripts, and when you're actually looking at the material manuscript and you see how it's put together and how pages are organized and all those other kinds of features that we don't see coming through in printed editions, which is the kinds of texts I'm working with. There are only a relatively small number of printed editions anyway, and they tend to be done by lawyers or legal historians, and they're very much focused just on, let's get rid of all that extraneous stuff around the edges and just pull out the canonical legal content. And I'm actually finding the manuscripts themselves are so much richer than that. Mm-hmm. And that giving some insight into, I guess, the social lives of these texts and how they did circulate and create communities. And especially when you find, conversations between different owners over time within the same text, I'm starting to feel like I'm getting more of an insight into the social and emotional worlds of these early lawyers and their outlook, and not just their legal interests, but all the other kinds of interests and aspects of their lives. Like I do find in these manuscripts things like medical recipes and poems and other kinds of content that isn't even talked about when you see legal historians talking about these texts. So that's part of what I'm starting to look into now, is getting a better understanding of actually how the institutions of early common law professional legal culture, when common lawyers first emerged in the sort of 14th century as a recognisable profession, but understanding how they fit into the wider world in particular of medieval London, where most of them were actually based where their careers were built and their social networks were developed and so on. But sort of understanding the wider world and bringing in some of those other kinds of texts, like Andrew is doing as well with his material, is understanding what kind of literature were these people reading, what kinds of recreation were they engaged in. And there's certainly plenty of dicing and gaming and other things going on outside the serious study of the law. So that's where I'm going at the moment, and I'm really just starting to open them up. And what I hope to do really is really open these texts up, these manuscripts up, to scholars outside the field of legal history, and help, I guess, bring more awareness to this material, because there's so much of it, and most of it hasn't even been catalogued, let alone studied in any in-depth way. To open those up as a source for other scholars who are coming from other kinds of backgrounds, and not just from legal history. Yeah.
So listening to the two of you speak today, I'm thinking back on when I first heard your papers, which I was glad to be able to access successfully. And remembering that I thought in terms of Benedict Anderson and textual communities. In a way, all of us are talking about the framing of textual community and its relationship to other kinds of community. But particularly the two of you are talking about lawyers and the world around lawyers and the law. And I have to laugh and wonder if the world of lawyers is ever the world of others, in the contemporary world. I teach in a prison because that's a thing we should do. And actually, I got involved with that because of my sabbatical in Dunedin and because of my conversations with people involved in restorative justice. So bless you for all that. But it makes us always wonder, to the extent to which anyone in a legal situation is constructing his or her own experience in terms of something outside in the culture, some sermon literature, for instance, or whether those legal hands with their specific language, which confines, which creates boundaries for human experience, have shaped that inordinately. Or so I think both of you are interested in that, and then how the culture around that legal language divided by the English Channel in this case, which is interesting in itself, shapes the language in turn. So I very much enjoyed both of your papers and their mutual relation. And then I think the connection to mine in that regard is that my canons, they're not monks, they're canons, are immensely shaped by the texts which they understand to be normative for matters such as recreation. So, I mean, we're all in the same business here, but in different parts of it. But that legal problem occurs to me all the time in the contemporary world and when I do prison teaching, because it's the legal world, especially in the English-speaking tradition, which in one way or another we are all sharing, even if we're working in Flanders, as I also am, is pervasive in how we think about culpability, how we think about self-representation, how we think about performance. I mean, I think there's much rich connection here.
Mm. And that is partly what really drew me to the wider project I'm working on now, is thinking about, I think even now in common law polities like the UK and New Zealand and Australia, where we have inherited this tradition and this custom, and it largely goes unquestioned. I mean, we often acknowledge, you know, you see every once in a while there's some big scandal that blows up at a law firm or something and it's splashed all over the papers, and we see all the stuff about how, you know, there's still very few women represented at the higher levels of the legal profession and as judges and so on. But this is kind of, I guess that the deeply embedded history of that has really been hidden because no one's asked these questions before about, you know, how men of law, as they called themselves, as men, and, you know, their ideas about masculinity and their performances of masculinity, how it's actually shaped those, you know, the even legal language itself and the way, you know, legal ideas are formed and inherited and passed on. And this, you know, especially since the common law in particular has this great investment in precedent and tradition, and the way things have, you know, we do things this way because this is the way they've always been done. So I guess kind of bringing some questions to that, really, as to is this the only way to do things, or but to even kind of get into that in the first place, one has to understand, I suppose, the language and how the world is framed and epistemological outlooks and so on as the first part. So yeah.
Yes, I've very much take your point, Carol, about this difficulty you've got where primarily you're dealing with texts, in my case, that have been constructed by lawyers, and they have to be done in a certain way. And so in a negative way, you're thinking, well, all these texts tell us is what the law wants to happen. And
but I agree. There's much more. You know, there's much more.
Yeah. Well, there is the kind of more positive spin on it is that, well, lawyers have to frame this in a certain way because out there in the social world, there's a need to present yourself in a certain way, and they're drawing on these traditions, perspectives, and what is felt to be morally right and morally wrong, perhaps, in order to frame these particular stories. And so the hope is that you can go out from these stories to see the wider world, but not through the incidents that are described necessarily, but it's more the way they're done. But that is quite difficult, and it goes back to the phrase that you used, that textual communities is what you're fundamentally dealing with.
Notions of culpability are, I mean, all over the place in my work, obviously. I mean, the beautiful manuscript, which I talked about in my talk for this, is largely about what blame is and how it can be dealt with. So I'm always thinking about that, and how is it socially constructed? How is it theologically constructed? If we assume little literacy on the part of most of your pardonees or seekers of pardon, that does not mean that they are not tremendously theologically sophisticated from listening to public sermons. I mean, one thinks of Julian of Norwich being the classic example in that period of someone who knows just a whole lot about what's going on in the schools, but from listening to Dominicans through the slit in her wall. I mean, I think your work is really interesting to me because it speaks to that, because I'm sure it does bespeak not only the categories in which lawyers making a living doing this are trying to describe these things, but also some kind of pressure against all of those boundaries by ordinary voices. But I mean, it seems to me that they're broadly equipped to talk about what has gone wrong. And this business of recreation as necessary to the human spirit is absolutely intriguing. I agree, by the way, but how does that work? I think that's quite a wonderful question.
Can I ask then, Carol, does your text talk about, well, first of all, about recreation? Do the brothers ask about that?
No, they don't in this. I mean, and that is a word that does not appear very much in the 12th century monastic literature. It's a later medieval. I had never thought about that until you sort of raised that, but contemporary monastic communities always have recreation, which often means a glass of wine in the late afternoon, and that's an important moment in the day. And I think oraria, rather than programs for the day, talk about things like that much more than the theological literature I'm looking at. But you have cued me to watch for that, and my instinct is that we see it not very much in the 12th century, and that comes on later. But part of the reason for that is the survival of those detailed documents about what actually goes on in communities. In the 12th century, we're not, if those documents still exist, they tend not to be that detailed.
May I jump in with a question? Oh, Amanda, go ahead.
I just had a question, just following up on that for you, Andrew. I was just thinking about that the kinds of, when we think about the kinds of external influences you get on these documents and how the narratives are constructed to be plausible and to be credible and convincing in the context in which they're being delivered. You've talked about sort of, I guess, what we would think of as more prescriptive or didactic texts as an influence on these narratives, like homilies, and also I think you mentioned sort of medical, sort of broadly sort of medical, scientific, theological literature. But I'm also interested in whether you see any influences from more secular or kind of literary texts coming through in terms of the way narratives are presented. And I was particularly interested in that in some of the accounts you might get of violence and situations when violence is, if violence is in defense of your honor or, redressing an insult or something, that in secular, where you're looking at sort of chivalric or broadly chivalric literature, where that's actually the right thing to do, is to, defend your honor by, getting out your sword and stabbing someone or something like that. But yes, I'm interested in those other kinds of, whether you've had much time to look at that yet, I don't know, but those other kinds of more secular influences, I suppose, on those narratives.
Yeah, I suppose the simple answer is no, I haven't. It's kind of in my mind that certainly with the cases where you get, and they're more unusual actually, of supplicants with titles who come from some minor noble family, and there are not so many of those. And again, they form a different kind of pardon letter. They have different tropes and so on that appear, and I'm quite sure that some of them are referring to the kind of chivalric behavior that you're talking about, in which the way they get into trouble mirrors some of the events that happen in romances, and that's very much part of their plea as well, to make them sound more plausible in terms of how they defend their honour, but also to model themselves on these characters too, so that they become more acceptable and presentable. But the sense of honour, which certainly appears in many of these pardon letters, as originally in the classic book by Natalie Zeman Davis on these pardon tales, where the importance of honour is often highlighted. Where you've got slightly higher class supplicants, there is a deliberate effort to refer to more chivalric kinds of behaviour. But which texts they might have used, I'm still not. I haven't fully followed up. So it's a good, yet another line of inquiry that has to be, unfortunately, dealt with.
And if I can jump in with a question for all three of you here, and the Natalie Zeman Davis connection is a great one, because you've been talking about the sort of social lives of these manuscripts and the textual communities. And the question I have is how these communities in your sources both lived through time, and what you can tell of the affective bonds of these communities. In other words, the emotional bonds. And Natalie Davis's book is great because one of the ways it starts is that, pardons are about a person getting to tell the king a story. And all of you have sources that tell either individually in a snapshot type way or as a chain of tradition. They tell stories about the people who are making these sources, passing them on, looking at them, using them. How do you see those elements of change or continuity over time figuring in your own cases? Because all of your papers actually cover a really broad chronological span. You have sources not just from decades, but across centuries. So that would be one thing. How does that textual community show the effects of time? And then the other is, what hints do you see of the emotional qualities within those communities, within those social and textual communities? And one reason I ask that is that medieval historians have pioneered in ways that have influenced early modern historians, such as myself, the history of emotions. Barbara Rosenwein and emotional communities, for one thing. So those would be my questions, and you can take either one of those aspects, either temporal or affective. And I'm curious to see what you see as playing out in your own work.
Well, monastic historians will always note that monks then and now always say that monastic life is like the rest of the world, only more so, that it's a kind of distillation of the forces which move the human spirit in community. And so a big book like the one I spoke of in my talk is a Wegweiser. I shouldn't use a German word in this context, but I can't think of the right French word for that. Is a guidebook to how one would live in community, and especially in the Augustinian tradition, to taking caritas, deer holding, charité, in that ancient sense, as the place on which the community stands to find the affective relationship with the divine. So it's intensely affective in itself. The particular book I was working on does not show a lot of lovely doodling like Amanda's, does not show us the kind of masculinity that this men's community embraced or failed to embrace, stood away from embracing. But what it does show is the sheer importance of the artifact in its exquisite preservation. I mean, I think there's silences which we can read here. The fact that it is not scribbled in or commented on means probably that for that community across centuries, it had a kind of iconic function in which it was understood that, we will write in the margins of some books and others we will not dog ear. And so I think my book speaks from its silence that way. I was very impressed by Amanda's wonderful doodles, and not so much the provenance, but the ownership traditions of some of these volumes and the way these individuals seem to be connected to each other by the text.
Well, if I could, I guess I could pick that up there, is that I think one of the interesting things I'm finding about the early professional legal community is that it has this very strong spatial aspect, and that, you know, to a large extent, their working lives, but also their social lives and their domestic lives, they're living and working together for large parts of every year in these all-male Inns of Court and the Inns of Chancery. And there is a lot of other material outside the specific text I looked at for this presentation, but the sort of the records of the Inns of Court themselves, the Inns of Court and Inns of Chancery themselves, where they have their sessions where they discipline the members for various infringements of the rules and so on. But they have there's a really interesting tension going on between their ideal vision of themselves as these very well-ordered, sober kinds of communities of lawyers, and the reality that they're living, which is that they're living in the middle of a part of London which at the time was very disordered. It was, you know, kind of didn't really have any proper oversight or jurisdiction, because it was falling in between other jurisdictions, and so it was full of, you know, ale houses and taverns and brothels and gambling dens, and the attempts by the inn's governing bodies to kind of maintain this sense of sort of sequestered studiousness and the reality they're dealing with. And what is very interesting in looking at the development over time is, although in the early days, so when the inns first emerge, as far as we know, somewhere in the early 1300s, it is very much just lawyers and law students, but over time they attract more and more sort of sons of the gentry and the elite who have no interest at all in becoming lawyers. They're there because it's a convenient and very nice place for them to live in the middle of London. It's very close to the court, and the royal court, that is, and, you know, the centre of government. But you have these very interesting tensions that then develop between the men who are serious about the law and who see themselves as men of law, and all the other members of the inns who are, you know, much more interested in other diversions. So seeing that sort of playing out in some of these texts is quite interesting, where you see it's sometimes only glimpses or hints, but elements of that sort of elite, especially the aspirations to knighthood and to that much more courtly culture starting to come through within the manuscripts themselves, and sort of in terms of the kinds of interests that are being displayed, and some of the marginal comments about you know, the drama and theatre and things that have been staged in the locale, and other kinds of very much non-legal interests that are being reflected. So that's really something I'm only starting to work on now, but I definitely hope to trace, hopefully, looking at some of the trends and perhaps changes over time in that early period.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as for me, one thing again that I hadn't thought about enough, and it's prompted by your question, Joe, is that of course the manuscripts I'm dealing with are registers in the equivalent of a chancery, which includes other kinds of documents and legal statements and decrees and so on, and they're written up into these registers. But of course, they existed first of all as a petition, but we just don't have, most of these don't survive. But the petition is included within this general pardon, and so it's it's encrusted in other kinds of legal necessity. And what you dearly like to have is both the original petition, but also petitions that didn't make it to the registers at all. And there were precious few. Though I don't know of any from my period where this is. I think this exists for the French, in the French context, but not necessarily the Burgundian. But what you kind of want to know is what the original petition looked like, how it was altered, and what petitions just never made it, and why. And that would be probably the most interesting thing, and I'd like to find. But so how these registers were actually used, to follow up your question, I haven't really thought about whether, in fact, legists and notaries themselves would go back on these registers and look at precedent and, well, how do I do things? I mean, there were kind of pro forma types of pardons and petitions that were to be written up, but I don't know enough about exactly how these registers were actually used. But it is quite an important question as to know what traditions they developed. But as your second question, I suppose when I'm thinking of emotions and as they appear in the text, yes, they are full of emotions and passions, because in many ways this is how the crime is often presented, especially if it's a homicide, that the passions have to be involved in some way. So how they are and how they're kind of managed is a very important part of the pardoning process, and how you present yourself. And so typically the male supplicant anyway will make great play on the fact that throughout the proceedings, but leading up to the homicide, he had been trying to govern his passions of various sorts, and then is finally provoked and then he uses the kind of the medical terminology of hot bile welling up, and this is what finally, but that's a kind of excusable thing. But throughout has to show himself as being able to regulate, self-discipline himself, but also show discipline towards others as well. And that's how his recreation and how his other activities are represented. So that there are these emotional communities that are clearly being developed and referred to in order to create this sense of pardon. As I was kind of hinting in a sentence, it's for women it's different, as ever. And so some of the interesting cases are these female supplicants, and they obviously have to do something different, and how they present their passions and emotions is different from men. But I'll pause there, because that can lead to yet another.
I have to jump in. I have to jump in at this point and say, amazingly enough, we've already reached the 35-minute mark. So, so we'll finish up in 5 minutes, and I'd like to leave the last words to the three of you to reflect on the experience of this panel, to ask one another questions. So, in the last 3 to 5 minutes that we have, what would you guys like to talk about amongst one another, or what questions do you have for each other? And then we'll wrap up.
Well, Carol, could I wanted to know more, and there won't be time, but to get a sense of what kind of spirituality that Philip is therefore trying to develop amongst his brothers, because what you've kind of recovered this text into its proper context, and therefore we're able to read it rather differently. But it's to situate it within the mid-12th century context as the kind of spirituality that he's trying to develop, and how that's different from others, or how it's the same, or whether there's something new or within this period of reform. That's the kind of question I would like to know you more. But of course, yeah, you can write a book on that, I expect, and
Yeah,
we don't have time.
But I mean, the short answer there is that was a golden moment in which many people, not just Philip, felt that the world would become new. I don't want to say brave new world, because that would trivialize it. And one of the things I'm interested in is the nostalgic way at which that moment was looked back upon in the 13th century as the mendicant orders came to be. But Amanda, I wanted to say to you that I'm also tremendously interested in the framing of masculinity and gender in the Middle Ages in general. And I thought that your work made me think about the way history is written, to go back to Natalie Davis, in the margins. I mean, that we see the reception of the work in the margins. The imagining the isolation of women's voices from legal tradition across many centuries is really challenging. So I wanted to mention that.
Yeah, it is. It's very interesting, and finding women anywhere in those kinds of texts and in the broader legal community in general is they are there, but they have no name. You know, they're servants or tavern maids and things. They have no names and no real identity. So that's a challenge, I think, that is an interesting one. Andrew, I actually had a question for you. One of the things you talked about towards the end of your talk, I think you were talking about the emergence of an idea of recreation time as being sort of a kind of a distinctive time in a person's day, or in a sort of daily life cycle, separate from sort of work and time spent in devotion. I was actually interested in whether or not there is any connection there to broader shifts in kind of religious sensibility and to the relationship between the sacred and the secular, especially thinking about the sort of later medieval urban communities and expanding kind of secular civic authority to kind of claiming more and more authority over aspects of, I guess, what you might call broadly moral conduct. So becoming more focused on things like, you know, defamation and slander and adultery and all those kinds of issues that were originally more the purview of kind of ecclesiastical authority. So I'm just curious as to whether that's something you've kind of looked into, or whether you think there might be something there, I guess, especially looking more into the, you know, the later 1400s and early 1500s.
Yeah, again, it's another big question, which I somehow have to answer quickly. But it's I think you're absolutely right that broader civic context that I'll have to look at as well for an understanding of ideas of recreation and not just what municipal authorities are up to, because you're right, they do encroach upon what was traditionally thought of as more kind of spiritual matters and morality and so on. But the whole question too as to of urban space and the way in which there are spaces set aside for secular entertainment, and there seems to be more of those from the mid-14th century onwards, whether it's archery fields or gaming rooms or so on. So that you could make a case for a growing secularity there and relate that to recreation. The only problem I suppose I've got with that is that what really municipal authorities prefer to do is to not sort of make things more secular, but to make their rules seem more sacred. And so they encroach in that way, so that they're not developing a kind of separate secularity, but they're simply saying that what their activities are in fact, and what they say is related to divine authority rather more. And that's rather, it's not quite the same as secularization. But I will pause there because that could lead to lots of other questions too, which we can have talk amongst ourselves afterwards.
And I think it's testimony to the wonderful conversation we've had here that our time is up, but I feel that we're only starting. So on behalf of SFHS and the Rudé, let me thank you for the 3 fascinating papers, Carol, Andrew, and Amanda, and also for a marvelous conversation. And with that, I think unless anyone has a final word, our panel 19 comes to a close.
Thank you.
Thank you.